Welcome. My name is Dr. Ron Pitblado of Ridgetown College of Agricultural Technology. If you've been following our series on mushroom production technology transfer seminars, sponsored by the Ontario chapter of the Canadian Mushroom Growers Association, with financial support from the federal Hort FSAM program, you will recognize that we have had numerous world-class speakers sharing their thoughts and experiences with us. This tape that you are watching is part of the 8th and last of these technology transfer seminars, focusing on water and its effect on mushroom production. 1.5 days were devoted to this subject, featuring David Beyer of Penn State and Pieter Vedder, now living in the United States. This second tape, part B if you wish, highlights Pieter Vedder. Many of you realize Pieter was once the director of the Mushroom Training Center in Horst in the Netherlands, and was the original author and editor of the Green Book, one of the classic texts of mushroom information. During this 8th technology transfer seminar on water and its effect on mushroom production, there are many other topics raised that I felt needed to be captured on tape. I hope these additional comments will be of interest to you. And now Pieter Vedder talking about mushrooms.
Yeah, why do we start with the world production of agaricus? Because I'd just like to show you how much water we are producing actually, huh? And try to sell that. We joke, you know, from origin we are Dutch, and a big part of our country is below sea level, so we have to fight water all our life, and also we get a lot of water into the Netherlands from Germany, Switzerland, France, and so on, and that's quite often polluted because there are chemical industries in the Ruhrgebiet and so on, and we are at the end of the drain, so we all have to clean it up. And mushroom growers in Holland sometimes joke and say, okay, we produce a lot of mushrooms and export them to Germany, and so we export actually, oh, you know all that, 92% or so of a kilogram of mushrooms is water. So we joke, we said we get the water polluted from the Rhine, yeah, we change it into mushrooms and then we sell it back to the Germans, but now it costs you 3 guilders or Deutschmark per kilogram. Now, if we talk about growing mushrooms, last seminar, we talked quite a bit about quality, about piece weight and so on. Now you see, we create the conditions, or we grow under the proper conditions naturally. But under the same conditions, you see here the same temperature, whether that is in Fahrenheit or 17, 18 in Celsius, the relative humidity is the same, the CO2 concentration is the same, but still you see quite a difference because the material underneath is different. I often use that saying, mushrooms don't grow on aluminum racks, or mushrooms don't grow on computerized facilities. Mushrooms grow on compost. I saw you this morning carrying in your valuable stuff, and you can't live without, I know that, so even if you go off for a couple of days, you carry your compost with you. God, I suppose we are in the wrong business, but nevertheless. You have made that choice, so we have to go on. But again, a big part of it is that moisture level. That seems to be so critical, and everybody can grow mushrooms 4 pounds per square foot, or if you talk about kilogram, everybody can grow 15 kilogram or so per square meter, but to stay in business you need a little bit more. It is just that last kilogram and just that little bit better quality what keeps you in business. So there are all kinds of relations between that moisture level and the compost quality. because that moisture level not only affects the development, the growth of the mushroom, whether it is vegetative or generative, the mycelium or the fruit bodies, but before that it has already a big impact on that total composting process, whether that compost is in the optimum condition, nutrients-wise and so on. Therefore, growing mushrooms really starts with preparing compost, and that starts with a proper pre-wet. I'm still convinced, and again we have some experience, whether that is like in this situation bagasse, sugarcane bagasse, or whether that is wheat straw or rice straw or whatever, making good compost starts with the pre-wet. We have said quite often, as a mushroom grower, if you are able to manage water during composting and later on watering during the crop, you are already for 90% mushroom grower. So important. And again, if you think about the period that you were off a little bit in compost quality, and once in a while you are, then quite often it is related to water. The water was not in time, or a little bit low, or a little bit too much, or not uniform, or whatever. Therefore, the biggest thing is start with a proper pre-wet. There are several ways to do it, and in the past people came up with all kinds of ideas. Never, never forget the basics. The basic is, and you can come up with all kinds of machinery and all kinds of techniques, but it is as simple as this. Pre-wetting means make every piece of straw or material what you are using for making compost wet as soon as possible, every piece of straw, and cover it with some slurry, some type of nutrients for those microorganisms who are actually doing the job for you. And the very first mistake you can make is that you don't start uniform. What we see so often is this. What you see quite often is, if this is day 0, let's say this is where you start baking bales or start the pre-wet. How often, 3 days later, 4 days later, whatever you flip or you rig or whatever you do, you have to convince yourself if that material is uniform wet, every piece of straw. And what you see quite often, not on your farm, but on all the other farms where we go, is this. That at the moment of the first turn or flip, you have already material quite wet, dark, But you also have material, say, reasonable, and you even, after 3, 4, 5, 6 days, whatever it is, you still have just yellow, dry straw. You have that seen before? Again, not on your farms, but you visit some other farms and you will see that, Now, if you continue composting this kind of material, let's say this is the first day of rigging. Part of the material is already reasonable dark. Now the problem is that this kind of material will compost much faster as that, or even don't talk about that. This material is the first day, hopefully, that it gets some water as well. So you end up somewhere here at the moment of filling, 12 days, 13 days, whatever days, you end up with a reasonable material, average, but still part is already somewhat overdone. But you have to go that way because part is reasonable, but also a part is even somewhat underdone. And that part is creating the problems. First of all, the water in that part is not really incorporated. That is just water on the surface, so a little bit drying and it's gone. And also that part is not really well composted, is not selective. That part is creating the high temperatures during spawn run. Even before that, during phase 2, that kind of material makes that you have a problem controlling the proper temperature because that material likes to go wild. What that material is doing is, during phase 2, what it should have done during phase 1. Okay, you can say, let's go then a little bit further. Let's give it another turn. Yeah, but if you give it another turn to keep that material, to bring that material to that point, then you are a little bit overdoing there. Or you bring in the water too late. And again, then the material starts the optimum activity at a later point, creating some problem. So the first thing is try to find a way to make that material uniform wet as possible. You have to realize what's composting. We will go over a few factors later on. Composting means that we give certain microorganisms the opportunity to do in 2 weeks what they normally do in half a year. Just break down that material. And you should never forget the role of mushrooms in nature. People sometimes forget what the role of mushrooms in nature is. Kids from the city at the moment don't have the slightest idea why a cow gives milk. They think that is to feed them. They never realize that that cow originally gives milk to feed a calf. There are even kids at the moment, they say we don't need cows anymore because we get the milk from the factory anyway. Yeah? Our mushroom, the role of our mushroom in that total process is, if certain plants are building up organic material, green plants, influence of the sun, catch the energy from the sun and so on, building up carbohydrates, must be in called. Then at the end of the cycle, there are another group. These are what we call the autotrophic organisms, the ones with the green stuff, able to catch the energy from the sun and build it in organic material. And the other group, the heterotrophics, we belong to that group, mushrooms belong to the group, yeah? Not having that chlorophyll, that green stuff, we are not able to catch the energy from the sun, and although we need the energy badly to move, to work, to live, and so on. So we depend on what this group build up for us to break that down. Again, we belong to that group, but also mushrooms belong to that group. In that total cycle of breakdown, most times the easiest degradable material, carbohydrates, sugar type stuff and so on, is broken down by, for instance, bacteria, and then the next molds and so on, and then the more complicated material needs a little bit more complicated system to be broken down, and then here in that group a certain part can be broken down only by a certain group of organisms, toadstools, mushrooms. Those mushrooms have a certain tool, a certain ability, kind of enzyme system, that gives them the ability to break down parts of that somewhat more difficult group of carbohydrates. So, knowing that there is a lot of competition for that food, there are thousands of molds, bacteria, microorganisms, all looking for growing on that kind of material, we have to make a selection. And by composting, we are doing that. So what we actually do is we put a pile of organic material, put some water on it, because that's the only way to activate these microorganisms to start their job. Did you ever realize why we can store straw? Why can we store straw for a year or two or so without breaking down the material? What's key? As long as that moisture level is below 14, 12%, then you can store it. That means that below that moisture level, whatever organisms are not interested because there is not enough water available. At the very same moment that you are adding water, then you create some activity and they will start breaking down part of that organic material. Does it make sense to you that they start breaking down first the most easy degradable part of it? Perhaps you have seen the drawing, I made that before. If you talk about organic material, sea sources, carbon sources, then I suppose you recognize certain carbohydrates as easy degradable, like sugar. The most simple carbohydrate. And there are a lot of organisms attracted by the most easy degradable stuff. So if you have a pile of organic material and you put some water on it and there is some food available, and the food is often available in the material itself, if not so, then you can start by adding some material like chicken litter or some food. But at least you can imagine that at the very same moment that you start some activity here, the first what they will break down is the easiest degradable material, the sugars, the starch, the cellulose, the hemicellulose, and you end up with the more difficult or almost very hard to break down material like lignin, humus, and so on. Now, there is a lot of competition for this part. All kinds of bacteria, competitor, wheat molds, they can break down that material. So if we like to prepare a selective compost, then we better give those organisms the opportunity in the pile, in the rick, and say, okay, go ahead, take what you want, and the leftovers are more difficult for the competitors, and only certain groups, basidiomycetes, mushrooms, toadstools, with that ability to break down the somewhat more difficult degradable material can grow on that, can break down on that. But doing so, we are losing, we have to sacrifice almost 50% of the total amount of dry matter. Again, you have to realize you could grow mushrooms on that material, but it is too risky because so many other organisms are interested. Maybe you have heard in the past about the work, what they did in Germany, Max Planck Institute, Dr. Thiel, and so on. They said, you don't need composting. Again, back to the basics. Why are we sacrificing 50% or something like that of our organic material? We do that because there is all kind of competition. There are all kind of competitor molds, weed molds. So we have to sacrifice that amount of dry matter. Dr. Thiel said no. If we make sure that we don't have competition of microorganisms, then you don't need to sacrifice, then you don't need to compost that material to break it down. So what he did was, he sterilized his compost, just mix it well, put some cottonseed meal in it, that means some protein type stuff, the certain amount of water, say 70% or whatever water, gypsum, and start spawning. And you can do that as long as the material is sterile. So one of the two. You make sure that there are no competitors, which is very difficult because sterilization of such an amount of material is very difficult. Or you have to live with the fact that there are that many competitors, but then you have to make your compost selective. Make your compost selective. And you do that by, you start adding water to your organic material and let the microorganisms break down that material up to a certain point. We have to justify that mainly by experience. You can measure some parameters, but very difficult. And then automatically you understand that if you start here not uniform, then you will end up with a situation that part of the material is already broken down up to this point, which is a loss. Part of the material will be okay, just fine, and say, okay, that is just the balance between at filling for phase 2. That is just, we still have enough activity and not overdone, fine. And part of the material, if you started being too dry, too late, and so on, will still be somewhere here and will create quite a bit of problems, whether in phase 2, during spawn run, and later on in the production, because the material is not really broken down. And broken down means for the big part, if you see here a piece of straw, you have to realize that you have to break open the structure of that straw, the cell structure, to first of all make the food available and also make sure that there is enough water in that material, and not on the surface, but really, David mentioned the water retention. Yeah? There's not only the water holding capacity, but for the biggest part also if that water is really incorporated in the structure, in the fibers and so on. Now back to that point, the pre-wet. The pre-wet machine is not a miracle. We often see that on a number of farms, growers like to pile up huge piles with the loader, and the only result is that you create ununiformity. In the center of such a pile you create already activity, and after 2 days or 3 days you will figure out that this material didn't change a bit, and then inside it had been already somewhat composted, it has already some different color and so on. So if you put that material in a rig, then you create exactly what I'm trying to tell you here. So in my opinion, what you should do is have that material as quick as possible in a rig, and from there on continue the uniformity. Again, there are all kinds of pieces of equipment built by several farms. This is what they built on a farm somewhere on the west coast, a machine where you dump whether the straw or the horse manure in a kind of a big conveyor belt, and here there is a device where the straw is squeezed, and at the very same time they added water so that the straw pieces are not cut, shortened, but just crunched more or less so that the straw can pick up the water. Here you see one of those more sophisticated pre-wetting installations with different stations. Here you start with a bale breaker, and then you see stations for adding chicken litter or cottonseed meal and gypsum and water over the entire length of the conveyor belt. So this is a kind of quick pre-wetting. Here you see it in action with the stations for, again, chicken litter, gypsum, etc. At the moment, you see, still the problem is, first of all, such an installation costs quite a bit of money, and maintenance is, especially maintenance is a headache. And also the problem is quite often that they make the material too short, because composting doesn't mean that if we talk about breakdown, we talk about breaking down the cell structure, but at the very same time we like to keep that structure long, because we need that structure later on, whether in phase 2, especially if you do phase 2 in a tunnel and so on. So the trick is make it wet, crunch the straw, but don't cut it mechanically in short pieces. And that is what that machinery is doing too much. You should not forget, talk about compost turners. We are still using compost turners designed 20, 30 years ago. At that time the straw was longer most times, somewhat tougher, and we are still doing more or less the same. And yesterday or the day before yesterday I read again Jeff Genney's diary in the Mushroom Journal, and Jeff said for one day, we overhauled a compost turner. He figured out that those pedals were almost gone, and instead of a pedal it was more like a knife, and so on. And after working on that compost turner, it was a hell of a difference. Okay, that's what we should not forget. Like today and tomorrow, we spend quite a bit of time on all kind of background, and that's good. So that you do a better job if you understand what you are doing. But don't forget that the implementation is quite often at that level. Yeah? Again, people now, we know some farms who are really willing, or at least talking about, investing quite a bit of money in one of those more modern phase 1 facilities, indoor composting. And sometimes I don't understand why they think about spending so much money on an indoor composting, and at the moment they are running a 25-year-old compost turner. I mean, then there is a lot to improve at this particular moment without spending all that money. Just implement what we know. Last time I have said that, and it is so true. One of our good friends in mushroom business, Kuhn in Switzerland, often said to me, it is not so much that we don't know what to do, but get it done. So quite often we write down here all kind of notes and say, okay, important is pre-wet and da. Yeah. But the point is, you go home and try to implement that. Yeah? Try to figure out how to do it on your particular farm. Whether you do it, like I've shown you, with going over the material, or have a sprinkler system, or whatever. There is not a magic solution for that. You can buy one of those modern double T machines or Traymaster. Yeah? But again, there's nothing magic. They will help to do the job, but there is quite a difference between that machine and what perhaps you are doing today. Just everyday's management. Every day, that's the point.
Our host, Dr. Dan Rinker, offered the group an opportunity to evaluate and estimate the moisture content of Phase 1, Phase 2, and casing soil samples. 5 samples were thoroughly examined, A to E. Peter did spend some time to comment on the compost and casing samples provided.
Different material, a little bit less done, somewhat longer. And it looks like if somebody added water just prior to filling this bag, isn't it? I don't know. Again, I'm not trying to figure out that you're.
I don't think it got dug in too deep enough. There was a tarp over that section.
Yeah. So it actually is not a representative, complete representative. What I like at this compost is the structure and the uniformity.
It's 2 days before till.
Yeah, yeah. And for a tunnel, I like that structure. And again, the uniformity. If you compare that kind of material with this kind of material, talking about uniformity and, I mean, here you see immediately what's lacking uniformity. There are some yellow straws in it, and this material is shorter than this. Shorter is not telling you the entire story about done or well done. Shorter means often shopping by means of...
That's sticky too. Why is it sticky?
Yeah, I think, and I will turn that upside down. We don't know what compost that is, but it's not the greatest. But I don't know the number even. Oh. yeah, that's closer to that, but that's for me not ready yet. It's too green, and of course it has structure then, but still here also a question of somewhat uniformity, but mainly it has to go, if it is the intention of this compost to fill it, I suppose that will be tunnel compost, but still there are some areas where again the uniformity is a little bit, and it should go for I have good reasons to believe that I'm a strong believer in reasonable, well done material. I prefer this because the color, the darkness and so on above this, especially the uniformity, some actinomycetes, and again the moisture could be a little bit on the high side, although this kind of material can handle that kind of moisture. If you add the same moisture to material like this, then I suppose you are in trouble. Huh? But come on, you are the experts. What do you think? Huh? You keep it. I like this kind of compost. This is more or less the equivalent of this material. It's somewhat darker, a little bit longer, but this in general, the uniformity is good. Huh?
That's nice compost.
That's nice compost, yeah.
No free water at all?
Mm. Proper moisture. And now you understand more or less why I didn't fill in that form, because I'm not a believer in that kind of figures. First of all, this compost, you said already, this is not representative completely, because maybe somebody put a little bit on the top or whatever. And the other thing is that this is today's compost, and tomorrow maybe a different picture, and so on and so on. As long as you for yourself know that I can handle this and so on, build up your own ideas about it. But nevertheless, it is good to do that kind of things, because then at least a bunch of people are making their hands dirty, and that's what you should do as a... We talk first about phase 2. Huh? I don't know if A from over there is A from here. Could be by okay, but this is the same kind of lumpy material. I think this is a little bit overdone or whatever it is.
Yeah, they are the same letters are the same.
Okay, they are the same. Somebody told me this morning, perhaps yes, perhaps no, but even if it was no, then still the characteristic of this compost is more or less the same. And could well be that, again, partly during the process, the water has been built up gradually, and maybe part was already ready after 9 days to fill, and you keep going, and then you create kind of material like this. It's not the greatest. This one has a kind of a typical smell. I don't like the smell too good, and it indeed could be the same number. If that is E, then it could be the same product from yeah, you see a lack on uniformity. There is still at this particular moment, there is some yellow stuff in it, moisture levels. If you are a little bit on the higher side with this kind of material, you will create a problem. So it's not the greatest material. Moisture levels in general are okay. Here we are losing already a little bit during the day. Of course, this feels a little bit more wet. I think that will be the highest. And this material is the compost who can handle not that moisture level because of the greasiness already built in. I judge these all around 65, 67, something like that. Maybe this one a little bit lower. But I don't know if I get a bottle of wine for that comment. Yeah. If you listen to what I said is, then of course it is not difficult to figure out what my favorite casing material should be. That is 1 and 2 and then 3, 4 or something like that in that sequence. I like that heavy, wet material. And here again, it will be easier sometimes to squeeze out water of this material as this material. Yeah? Because this is a little bit more brown peat and so on. And it is the... And again, we even believe that it could be more heavy as this one. If you have some black peat available or so, then you could make it even heavier as this one.
A little easier to drain moisture out of that one there that you're...
It looks like, huh? Yeah. Yeah. It looks like. There's some more black peat in it, or where is it coming from, the black color?
It's the difference in lime. That's got a B2 limestone in it.
Yeah.
And the others all have either
Spent lime.
spent lime or the fine lime.
Fine lime. Yeah. Mm. I think this kind of material in combination with spent lime would do it. I don't understand why you are not using all spent lime.
I didn't even know it was available here.
It's not available?
I don't know.
If you don't know, then you didn't try. Huh?
Michigan.
It is available.
Michigan.
What exactly is spent lime?
They squeeze out, they crunch the sugar beets or the cane. They squeeze out the liquid. They filter that liquid, but there are still protein particles in that liquid, and they are not able to filter that out. What they are doing then is they put lots and overdoses of calcium carbonate in that liquid, and then the calcium makes that the particles are coagulating around those calcium particles, and then you can filter them out. And then you end up with a clear liquid, which is sugar, water, and those filters, they call that a filter cake, and the filter cake is for the biggest part calcium, just calcium carbonate, some particles, protein particles, tissue from the sugar beets, and a little bit of clay from the beets or from the cane or whatever, and that's what it is. So there is some sugar in it, very little, and that is the reason, I suppose, that if you put it on a pile, then automatically it will compost a little bit because the easy available carbohydrate. So what it is actually is for the biggest part calcium carbonate. So I'm a strong advocate of using spent lime for several good reasons.
What are your reasons?
Mhm.
What are your reasons?
The main reason is, first of all, that kind of characteristic of the casing, and related to that, yield and quality. And also the forgiveness. The material looks like more forgiving in up and down. Price-wise, I can't answer that. I can't say that for Canada. I don't know how it is here. But the buffer capacity, it gives the opportunity to add up to 25% or so to the material, and still not increase the pH too much, still have a lot of buffer capacity. We have very good experience with spent lime. Yeah. But again, one thing is that it has to be weathered for a year and a half, 2 years or so. That is actually the best thing to do. So you have to build up your own pile or make a deal with the company or whatever you are dealing with to have that material at least a year and a half or so old before using it. Yeah.
Why does that have to be weathered?
I'm sorry?
Why does it have to be weathered?
Okay, after the process it seems to be that there are still some protein particles in it, and we like to more or less compost that away. And you see the change in color also. Sometimes it is a little bit anaerobic after, if it is young material, and then later on it turns into a kind of a gray brownish material. That seems to be the point to use it properly. On the other hand, weathering gives you of course the opportunity that on the surface some weeds are growing and some nematodes developing. Although I must say that the Dutch who started using that stuff, they never disinfected their casing material, neither the peat moss, neither the spendlime. And we know there are a few nematodes in it, but personally I'm a strong believer in the natural antagonism, and we figured out if your vegetative spawn growth is strong, even if you have a few nematodes, then they don't develop. And even if you disinfect the material and you have a few nematodes and the spawn growth is weak for whatever reason, after a couple of weeks you will have 1,000,000. That's more or less the same philosophy as this morning when we talked about adding those bacteria to compost or something like that. If you create the proper conditions, they will develop anyway. If not so, they will not develop or die. And the very same, in my opinion, for those saprophytic nematodes. If you create the proper conditions and you have a start number of 10, after 3 weeks you have X million. And if you have a start number of 10 and let's say that the vegetative growth is strong, so you build up a good antagonism, you still will not have a reasonable number after. So that's my favorite casing soil, especially since we started years ago doing phase 1 under controlled conditions, we learned a few things. First of all, we learned how important it is to start uniform. One of the advantages of doing things under natural conditions is that sometimes Mother Nature is straightening out certain things. I'm the son of a market gardener, and I remember that my dad was building number 2 or number 3 complex of glass houses, and I also was a little boy, and I said, "That's great." "Yeah," he said, "that's great, but don't forget, from now on, if you cover that with glass, we are responsible for what's going on underneath." You follow what he was, yeah? Before Mother Nature let it rain, but now, we are responsible. And that is the very same if you do phase 1. Under controlled conditions, you better know what to do. And really, we didn't know that. So I'm talking about the industry, and especially the Dutch, they went the wrong way. They went the wrong direction. Actually, the Dutch were thinking, mainly experimental station, that, hey, if we do phase 2 in a tunnel, we know the temperature, we know the oxygen and so on, and we just start a little bit earlier. They forgot, they didn't realize or they ignore the fact that it seems to be that during phase 1 you have to have a certain period of time high temperatures. And we can comment on that a little bit later. But coming back to your point, we also figured out that whatever anaerobic conditions, they are negative. In the past, I was one of the believers that in a very early stage, during pre-wet, and I have good reasons to believe that because backed up by some people like Dr. Staněk in Prague and so on, well-known microbiologist who said, yeah, the water absorption of the straw is better if you are going through a couple of days, somewhat anaerobic conditions in an early stage. Later on you can correct that. So we even try to create some anaerobic conditions in the very beginning of phase 1 by driving over. You have seen one of the slides, with a front end loader or tractor driving over the material, crush the straw somewhat. That's good. But if you add too much water at the very same time, you always have to realize that that balance between the amount of water and air movement, oxygen supply. Yeah? And so at that time we created some anaerobic conditions, believing that that was good for the water uptake and the breakdown of the straw. But certain things changed. First of all, at the moment, our straw in general is not the straw anymore from 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. It is softer, it breaks down, it collapses easier and so on. So instead of try mechanically to crush it, we say, Yeah? I saw, let's see, a good example of that was, in my opinion, compost E in phase 2. Compost E phase 2. A little bit short, a little bit on the dry side. Yeah. Now, I don't like to comment now on those of them. Maybe we could sometimes, if you like, yeah, give our opinion. If you give yours, yeah. But we learned at that time that first of all, try to avoid under any conditions, under any circumstances, anaerobic conditions. And a big part of it is not only moisture level, but also shortness of the material. So we said, try in an early stage to cover every piece of material with a layer of slurry. I'm not using water. And go back to what David said, if it is a kind of a slurry, then there is a better water holding capacity of the particles. Yeah? Water would run off easier. But if it is a kind of runoff material with already some food, some bacteria, some germs in it, yeah, it sticks better to the pieces of straw. Try to crush them, but not chop it. Because for two reasons. Because you can't do the same in a tunnel, phase 2, as you can do in a thinner layer. If that material is short and a little bit on the wet side, that is the contradiction, then you can handle phase 2 maybe in such a layer, but not in such a layer. So the contradiction is, on the one hand, we like to have as high moisture level as possible, on the one hand, but on the other hand, we like to have the material long, and we keep the structure long and so on. That's a little bit contradictional, but we have to work on it. For that reasons, try to minimize the handling. And again, our compost turners, most of them are still running like they did 20 years ago. At that time, it was really part of the turnings, was really shortening, crushing the material. Not anymore so much. So we see on several farms that they improve their compost, the structure, by slowing down the speed, the drum speed of their compost turners. Instead of just having on the big drum, instead of just having that kind of metal parts, put a kind of pedal on it, something like that. so that it is not just shopping the material, but really more gentle, pick up, mix it, because the purpose of turning is not make it short. Still, the misunderstanding often is that short material means uniform. You can have short, chopped, ununiform material and long, well done, uniform. You see good examples over there. Let's see. Compost C, whatever, whoever made it, is, although, in my opinion, somewhat on the underdone side, a little bit on the green side, but has good long structure. Though I think I like that material, I like it a little bit more done, but especially for tunnels, that kind of stuff. Later on we will figure out who is the owner of C, and you see, I mentioned that already last time. The reason that I can give you my figures, but I didn't put it in. First of all, I really don't like to take away the opportunity that I got the prize.
Don't worry about it.
That's not fair, huh? So I said, no, I can't do it. Talking about composting, what you are doing is you are burning off carbohydrates. Not because our mushroom could not utilize them, but it is too attractive for competitors and so on. So, here we start pre-wetting. Pre-wetting means more or less prepare the material for the big happening. Yeah? Here you start biological activity. Microorganisms are breaking down that kind of material, and that material, of course, is organic material. So, if you start here at the beginning with, for instance, a CN ratio, everybody, I suppose, understands the CN ratio, the ratio between the amount of carbon and nitrogen. In straw, the CN ratio is more or less 80. That means 80 to 1. 80 parts carbon against 1 nitrogen. That's straw. Our mushroom prefers a CN ratio, let's say 14 or something like that. 13, 14, 15. So straw is by far not the ideal substrate for growing mushrooms. So what we have to do is we have to narrow that. How can we do that? Now, first of all, if the CN ratio of straw is 80, and we should not add anything as just water, and we let microorganisms burn off a part of the easier degradable material up to the point where we were losing almost 50% of the dry matter. Let's say theoretically we are not losing nitrogen. The amount of nitrogen is changing, not the amount is changing, but the character is changing from into protein and so on. Can you tell me, if we are losing 50% of our carbon, what the nitrogen, what the CN ratio will be at the moment of, let's say, spawning? Instead of 80, As the result of that, it should be 40 to 1. You follow me? We are losing half of the, yeah? Now the very same, Mac, for the ash. If the ash was, for instance, 15% here, at the moment you start your composting process, 15% of the dry matter, what do you think it should be here, more or less? 30. More or less, yeah, because that's now telling you, first of all, if you have a compost with a ash level of, let's say, 28, and you visit another farm, let's say, give you a practical example, you visit one of the Campbell farms in Santa Cruz, California. They have ash levels in the 40%. Now, which compost is more well done, this one or that one? What do you think? First of all, what kind of ingredients? If you are using horse manure and chicken litter, your ash level will be higher. Why? It is as simple as that. There is more sand in it, just from the horses and the chicken litter. Yeah? If you start from the same level, and the one has a higher ash level than the other one, then for sure the one with the higher ash is more or less indicating that that material is more well done. The longer you go composting, the darker the material, the softer the material, maybe a little bit, up to the point that it gets almost a little bit gritty, that the ash levels are that high. That material, and you will talk about in this figure, maybe you compost too long, you overdo, that material will be rather selective, dark, up to the point that it almost starts to be greasy, but you are losing, instead of 50%, you are maybe losing 58% of your dry matter. So that balance, that's the point. And again, the key here is uniformity. The key is uniformity, because if you start at a certain point from here and apart from here and apart from here, if you end up at the moment of filling, you still have, and again, that compost E, in my opinion, is an example of that. You still have some yellow straw pieces, and other material, it's already on the border of being a little bit greasy, and that's just a question of a lack on uniformity. Now, okay, that is what the ash level is telling you. The other thing, what David is mentioning, and that is the other reason that I like the CN ratio so much, you have to realize that in the dry matter, if this is the total dry matter in compost, let's say you fill a compost 70% moisture or whatever, then it is understandable that 30% of that is dry matter. From that 30%, perhaps another, let's say, 28% is ash. Here. If you talk about nitrogen levels in the dry matter of 1.6%, then the CN ratio is this amount of nitrogen related to this amount of carbohydrates. Follow me? Carbon. But you see, if the ash level is, instead of 28, 40, then the amount of nitrogen is related to that amount of. So the CN ratio here in situation A, let's say, is maybe at the moment of filling is maybe 20, well, let's say 20, and where the ash level is 40%, the CN ratio is maybe, sorry, the other way around. This may be 26, and situation B, where that higher ash level, is maybe 20. So relative, in this compost, the nitrogen level is higher than in that compost. But you talk about the same figure. So what David is pointing out is it is not just that figure, but in relation, what they call the interaction between all those figures. And again, as a practical grower, I like to use that kind of visual judgment. For a big part, we can give you all kind of parameters, but, and that's perhaps a shame, if you talk with Gerrits in Holland, he spent his entire life in compost research, and he often said, now, he's not that dumb. He said, but it is a shame that I still don't understand that process. I don't know the real situation. It is still, making compost is still a question of a lot of practical experience and feelings and so on. And of course we developed some parameters and figures, ranges where you say, okay, if you stay in that range with your water, and if you stay in that range with your nitrogen, and if you stay in that range with oxygen levels and so on, then there is a good chance that you end up with a good compost. But again, I like to keep it as, for the group of people you have to work with on the slab, as practical as possible, and develop the tools, the feeling, the smell and so on, backed up by some reasonable figures, not writing down behind the comma and so on. On conferences and so on, people are, oh, we have better results with higher nitrogen. Can you imagine? And that's sad. And so people go home and think, let's go a little bit higher with the nitrogen. Not saying, first of all, what does it mean, higher nitrogen? Higher what? Percent, and give me the ash, give me the CN ratio, moisture level, and so on. So all related to that. And so again, if you go home with these kind of figures, yeah, be aware that they can be helpful, but you have to develop your own way, feeling and so on, and then try to back that up by figures under your conditions, your ingredients, your and so on and so on. That. And if you visit other farms, we have seen people made big mistakes as they went out and go to Switzerland and see Sinden farm or Kuhn farm, and they come home with some ideas, not realizing that you have to put that in perspective what they are doing under their conditions, and you try to copy that. That doesn't work that way. So don't jump from here till there, but try to... I told you last time, and again, we have seen so many farms all over the globe, and the money makers are not the exceptional, high yielding and so on, but the more steady ones. And I often realize that reading, I tried to write that book because in '62 or so, when we started the school in Holland, I suddenly realized that we need something in writing. I mean, we didn't know too much, but at least write down what you know, what you experienced. And of course, later on, you are learning, at least that's what you think you are doing, and more experience. And I try to update it because another translation or so on. And I often figured out that after 10 years, updating and fine-tuning, you suddenly realize that you wrote that already the first time in 63. Yeah? So you went a little bit from the left to the right and so on, but still the basics are the very same. And we often visit farms where they visit Holland. One of you mentioned that in Holland they know how to handle water. Yeah? And okay, then they come up with, oh, now we are doing much more dit or much more that. Yeah? Or we believe at the moment of spawning in 71, 72%. And say, what? Oh yeah, we're very successful doing so. You visit them 3 months later and you squeeze the compost and say, hey, what's going on? You try to convince me, yeah, you see, we had some problems. Of course you have some problems because you still grow the same mushroom. And you believe that at a certain moment that high moisture level was the miracle. That's of course not the miracle, you was just lucky. Maybe, again, there are 2 or more Dutch in this group. We call that in Holland the Christiaans effect. I told you that last time. The story was that Christiaans, a grower somewhere in Holland, had an experience during the night. The water line going from one room to another set of growing rooms broke down. And so the entire night the beds in that room got a full shower. They were as soaking wet as they could be. Okay, he was more or less ready to empty that room, but he did not because the water was dripping out. And okay, making a long story short, the yield was great. Yeah? So then the conclusion is, yeah, instead of break the water line, but at least water the hell out of it. Huh? Yeah. There is no explanation why that yield was as good. Maybe it was not, but telling the story 10 times, the yield were better and better. But that kind of, we often do that. Yeah, we visit a farm and then we go suddenly from here till there. That doesn't work. Go a little bit step by step, but don't forget the basics. And that's often what... We made the mistake in the past that we talk about days. And actually, now they say, you see, if you do phase 2 or phase 1 in a tunnel, you can do it shorter. Now, are there farms in this group who changed not that long ago from a conventional phase 2 into tunnel phase 2? You did? Okay, before you did 9, 10, 11 days phase 2, 12 days maybe? Yeah? And you do it in the tunnel, the same compost, more or less, and now you do it in 6, 7 days. You didn't shorten the process. You did the same in a shorter period of time. That's what you do. So, what I'm saying is that at the moment, what's going on in Europe or all over the globe is we try to optimize the process, and therefore we are able to do in 10 days or 8 days or whatever what we did before in 14, because from the 14 or the 20 days, only part of it was active. The rest was heating up, cooling and so on. If after 2 days that rick is running out of oxygen for the biggest part, then you can keep going for another 2 days, but nothing will happen. You are just adding days. So, if at the very same moment we have the tools and the equipment to measure the oxygen level in that pile, then the next step will be that turning the rick is not only a question of temperature, but a combination of temperature and oxygen levels. In the past we didn't have the slightest idea, We couldn't measure, and even now it is difficult, but at least that kind of things doesn't tell you exactly what to do, but it gives you an indication what to do. And at the very same moment that we can measure oxygen levels, then the big question is, what is the ideal oxygen level? Because we didn't know that so far. And more we figure out now that in that rig, we are thinking about something around the 10-12% level, not 19, 20, but yeah, for the time being. Maybe later on we learn more and more, but at least that's the way we are learning little by little by little, and that's the way I like to do it. Because again, if you have pollution problems, in maybe it is in the March of April Mushroom Journal, the MGA, the British Mushroom Journal. One guy was figuring out, and read that article from Ted Wessians, the guy from Theeuwen in Holland. They were figuring out that the biggest producer of that odor was not so much the rig, the ammonia, but for the biggest part, the chicken litter and the runoff, and the distribution of the runoff over the material. Again, the difference between that big sprinkler or just as close to the surface, low pressure distribution. That kind of things. And that doesn't need the big investments to close in the entire phase one. And again, that helps you, and that is the more important thing, that helps you to make a better compost. That's the point. And here again, realize what's good for you is good for the environment. You see, the point is, there are, in the past we have seen on the market all kind of activators. And quite often, those salespeople, mainly, I don't know if they're Dutch or not, but they, most not, they try to convince you that those activators, especially in Belgium, France, Italy, they were on the market at that time, and they have the germs of certain bacteria and so on. David later on has to correct me if I'm wrong, but our philosophy, my philosophy, is backed up by some colleagues and friends and so on. If you create the proper conditions in that pile of organic material, and those proper conditions for the development of whatever organisms are, make sure that there is enough moisture. Every organism needs that. And talking about enough for that process means indeed something between the lowest and the highest, 68, 72, if you are in that range for the entire process, great, moisture. Oxygen, we are not 100% sure, but at least I indicated already that there should be free oxygen available. We don't know exactly the optimum level. Maybe it is somewhere between 10 and 18% or so, maybe even less. We don't know exactly, but at least make sure that there constant is some oxygen supply. Water, oxygen. Nitrogen. We can argue for the rest of the day whether it should be 1.6 or 1.7 or 8, but we gave you already some thoughts about if, as long as you are in that range somewhere, then at least you can make a good compost. And fine-tuning, okay, later on. If you have those conditions, make sure that there is enough carbohydrates, and the entire pile is carbohydrates, but the availability is not always. So if you create those conditions, then you don't need to add those organisms because they will multiply like hell. Yeah? If they don't, because one of these parameters is off, then it doesn't help you a bit if you are adding bags full of bacteria because they will die immediately or not develop. So again, you start more or less automatically with the infection level, inoculum, what you need. And as I told you already, helpful could be, instead of using plain water, using runoff, because that is a kind of inoculum. Yeah? And if you create the proper conditions, from then it will take off. The use of sugar beet lime is based more on practical experience than on really research, although Visser in Holland has done quite a bit of research. It was actually by accident, more or less, that we used sugar beet lime many, many years ago in Holland. And the reason was, at that time, we started growing mushrooms in many countries, but also in the Netherlands, by using normal soil. We dug that up on the river, but more and more difficult to get enough and so on. And so peat moss came in. And although we have a lot of peat moss in Holland, but they give you a hard time over there to dig it up. Huh? Because you know all the rules and regulations. So we imported peat moss from Germany, from Ireland, and even Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and so on, but mainly from Germany. But then you have to add a calcium source to keep the pH bring the pH at a certain level, and not only bring the pH at a certain level, but keep it there, build in a kind of buffer, because as you all know, mushroom mycelium is producing organic acid, so if you don't do anything, then the pH will drop very soon. Just by more or less accident, people in the southwestern part of Holland, and I'm talking really about maybe 25 years ago, they had the sugar industry over there, and that sugar, that spent lime, looks more or less like the clay they were used to, and they put it on. And then at the same time, the government was promoting that, because what they did, the sugar industries, they put that stuff in the sea. There was no use for it, so at a certain moment the government forbid them to put that in the sea or in the river. And then the sugar industry was piling up and looked for some use. And so the Ministry of Agriculture promoted the use of spent lime. And so in the agricultural business, they put some on, and especially after the inundation, we had a disaster in 53, that the dike broke, and then the inundation and the salt and so on, and they figured out that we need a lot of calcium to add to, and so on. And then the government asked the experimental station to do some experiments if there was a use for that, because we are using quite a bit of calcium, yeah? And so we started using the spent lime. And then we figured out that it not only brought up the pH, but it has really an impact on the quality. And there we are touching a last meeting, we talked quite a bit more about quality, and we figured out that the main thing to control the quality is controlling the number of pins you develop. And the number of pins have a lot to do with, beside the strain and the flushing and how harsh or whatever. But if you can control the number of pins, then automatically you more or less control the number of fruit bodies, and by doing so the size and the weight of the mushrooms. And it has also to do with the availability of water and food underneath in that compost layer. Now, we figured out, and again, that is for the biggest part practical experience, but again backed up by some research, that the heavier that casing material, the more body that casing material has, the easier you can control the amount of vegetative growth. David mentioned already that if that casing material comes below a certain moisture level, then immediately the mycelium starts growing vegetatively very fine. And that creates a situation that after a first break it is more or less irreversible dry, and you can't get the water in anymore and so on. So, and especially the Dutch are good in that, and one of the most successful guys is maybe Jack Verdellen, somebody like you know where we are talking about, and his group, the Hiveco group and so on. Jack was, God, if you talk about growing quality mushrooms, not talking about quality and having 4.5 pounds or no, talking about 30 kilos plus and still have solid. And how is he doing it? For the biggest part, make a casing material as heavy as you can, as much body as you can have, and that is against your fluffy, you prefer that. If you squeeze that kind of casing, you can hardly squeeze out any water. But you can squeeze that stuff between your fingers. If you squeeze your material, that doesn't do too much. I have seen experiments. I was in Holland half a year ago, or it doesn't matter, and the cooperative was experimenting with preparing casing soil. The growers were asking for even more heavy stuff. And they were doing experiments how far they could go, adding that old black peat moss, adding more spent lime and adding more water, and still could empty the truck, because that was the limiting factor. So how far can you go and end up with a material what you can still, can. At that time, I was running the school farm. I was part of the commission for the ingredients. It was in Holland. The cooperative had a group of people watching the quality of the ingredients. The farm manager, Söbring, we were close together, of course, although we battled quite a bit, but nevertheless. At a certain moment, they brought us some casing material where Söbring came to me and said, being the director, you better goddamn complain, because look at this. And he was showing me some, and we have to make a casing layer out of it. Okay, next meeting I will complain about that kind of material, because that was like mud. The next meeting was, I don't know, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later. I didn't complain, because God, that mud produced not that much vegetative growth, just the white thick string, but beautiful quality mushrooms. And so we said, hey, instead of complaining, wait, maybe it should be that way. And I suppose a number of you visited growers in Holland or whatever, and not that the victory starts in Holland, but I mean they know how to grow mushrooms. I must admit that, especially a bunch of people know that. And so I'm a strong follower of that kind of philosophy. I like that casing material. I have seen here that on that side, that was more or less what I like, that heavy stuff. You can't squeeze that much water out, but that's not the point. It is a question of the availability, not so much what you can. And it seems to be that, and that's perhaps the point what we I will come back later, but Dave more or less forced us into this kind of discussion. And so I have to say a few things about that compost phase 2 and spawn run, but nevertheless, we do it like that. Do you agree that there is only one moment that the compost moisture is okay? There is only one break that the compost moisture is okay. Let's say there is mycelium, and if I make an enlargement of one of that hyphae, then it looks more or less like here is a soil particle or compost particle, and that compost particle is surrounded by some water, yeah, and then a hyphae is growing somewhere here, and then listening. I've been good friends many years with Dr. Staněk in Prague. He passed away. Dr. Staněk spent his entire life on research what he calls the hyphosphere. That means the surrounding of such a hyphae and the soil particles. And he is telling me, his wife was also working on that subject, and he is telling me that there is a very complicated interaction between those compost particles and those hyphae. He even believes that that mushroom mycelium is producing some metabolic products, and these metabolic products have effect on surrounding bacteria, and these bacteria are affecting the breakdown of protein particles and so on in amino acids. And as you know, and we are touching what David is trying to tell you, that a mushroom hyphae, mycelium, cannot pick up food in the form of particles, in the form of protein particles. It has to be soluble in water. So in that water, there are the broken down parts of those protein molecules in amino acids and salts and so on. And then, because of the mushroom expanding, enlarging, and also because the evaporation rate, you will have that osmotic effect. You are losing water here by, again, evaporation expanding. That means that the salt concentration, the nutrients concentration in that cell is higher, and that will pick up water through the membrane from the next one, and from the next one, and from the next one. And then here at a certain moment, you have that kind of battle between the two powers. That particle is holding the water with a certain power, depending on the salt concentration and so on. And here, the mycelium, who is more or less, because of the osmotic action, trying to equal that balance. Now, of course, the stronger the evaporation, the stronger the power, osmotic, but on the other hand, the higher the food concentration, the salt concentration, and depending on the characteristics of those particles, and there we are touching the quality, that seems to have an effect not only on the yield, quantity-wise, but also on the quality, the amount of dry matter, the balance between the amount of dry matter and water. Now, that is the reason that I say there is only once the ideal optimum moisture level in the compost. That's during the first break. After the first break is taken away, more or less the amount of water out of the compost equal to the amount of mushrooms what you pick from that particular bed. If you study carefully what Gerrits did and Kai Beck in Denmark and in Switzerland, come up with the name, Kalberer, yeah, then you will see that for the biggest part, although the moisture level in the casing is higher quite a bit than in the compost, still the mushroom will pick up most of the water out of the compost, which is understandable because here is where the food is. In the casing, there's no food. But that doesn't mean that the moisture level of the casing doesn't have effect on the moisture level of the compost. And there is where you touched this morning already, where the Dutch are scratching and so to get that water in. We will touch that later on tomorrow. Now, here, and again, I went into that compost, but here we are touching, I suppose, what that spent lime is doing for us in the casing. In the past, we could go a step backwards. If it was the water holding capacity only, then indeed we should have your casing material, that fluffy peat moss, because that can hold a lot of water like a sponge. Yeah, there you go. But that seems to be not working. You go to France or Italy and you see those guys, they grow mushrooms in the caves, and you know what they are using as casing material? You have been there? Huh? What do you think that we are adding lime, whether that is dehydrated lime or what, huh, to the peat moss. Do you know what they do? They add some peat moss to the lime. Maybe 10% or so. And if you ask them why they do it, they say, yeah, because over there, they always talk about over there, because they live in the ground. They are successful with it. They cover their beds with, there are growers, just calcium. No water holding capacity at all. But they don't water the beds. Why not? There you touch one of the basics. How in the world can they grow that quality mushroom? Because they grow rocks. And not watering the beds, and have casing material, just that marl, that's why. A big part, David mentioned that this morning already, a big part of our water is cooling, evaporation, controlling the temperature. Now in the caves they have a constant temperature of more or less 11 degrees Celsius. They have a break in 2 weeks because everything goes slower. They have one bed on the floor. There is hardly any air movement. And if there is any, the relative humidity is very high. We are using a lot of water in the casing because we are evaporating a lot of water. We create a lot of air movement because we have to create a lot of air movement because we have 5, 6, 7 layers in a growing room and so on. So, if you could avoid that, for the biggest part, then you didn't need that. Now back to our spent lime. We figured out that you can have high yields with that fluffy casing material. But you will have easier overpinning, and as the result of that, those little ones and all that. So if you like to control the number of pins, and doing so the size of the fruit bodies, then we have the best results with having a casing material as heavy as possible with a lot of what we call body, and it's very difficult to describe what we are looking for, but maybe that's part of the success of the spent lime and all that kind of clay type things, that it is not so much the water holding capacity as the water availability and what we call the pF. You all know what the pH means, yeah, and the pF is what they are using in soil. That means the tension between the moisture on the surface of soil or compost particles and the action from a root or mycelium, a hyphae. If you measure that, you talk about the pF. That seems to be a factor. And many years ago, we did some experiments, and also at GCRI, they did some experiments with adding salt to the casing to, of course, you can influence that pF. If you are adding salt to the water, you make it much more difficult to... You know, I'm born and raised growing tomatoes in hothouses in Holland. My dad was in that business. And there was a phenomenon that although the moisture level of the soil was high, the tomatoes during the day looked like they were dry. Can you imagine? You know why that was? That was a problem at that time in Holland. Salt. I mean, growing tomatoes for 20 years in a, there was not enough water to leach the salt. We are adding fertilizer and so on. At a certain moment, the salt concentration was that high that even if you gave enough water that it looks dark, the soil, but those roots from the tomatoes still were not able to pick up that moisture. That was one of the reasons that using that instrument to measure the moisture level in casing, there are instruments what they are using in horticulture to measure the moisture level of the soil. You can't use that in casing because, first of all, the conductivity, if you measure that, there's another part, is very much influenced by salt concentrations and so on, and the very same, and especially in such a thin layer, so that's the reason that never worked. So we have to go here, like in compost, with the same kind of things. You can measure in percentage. You can say, okay, that casing is 83 and that's only 79, but that's not telling you the whole story. So it is maybe not such a good scientific explanation why I'm a strong advocate of using spent lime. And the only reason for that, but that's maybe a good reason, is that gave us the best way, the easiest way to grow that kind of quality mushrooms what we like. At filling, a tunnel or trays or whatever, you can correct somewhat. But don't forget, in my opinion, it is aspirin. Yeah? You cover the headache somewhat, but maybe there is a reason. And so if you have to add water at filling, I think that is what you have to do. But it is not 100% correcting the problem. So if you end up with such type of compost, you should talk with the guys on the slab and say, hey, well, today we are a little bit on the dry side, and it should be much better if they give that water the last turn or even earlier. Huh? Okay, but the next thing what you have to do, and still a number of farms are suffering in that area, keep that moisture during phase 2. We see too many farms where at the moment of filling the tunnel or how many are involved in tunnels in this group? Quite a number. And the rest is doing, who is doing it in, let's say, the old-fashioned way, trays or, oh, still, okay. Both will figure out that quite often we start the right level, 72, 73, even 74, whatever that right level for you, and still we end up, God, huh? We are losing 5, 4, 6,
Depending on the material.
Up to 8.
up to 8. Your compost, if you are losing 8%, was not enough done at the moment of filling. That compost was too aggressive.
Or you have to use a lot of air.
And to control that, you have to use a lot of air, and you are losing quite a bit of water. So your solution is actually, like it most times is, go back to phase 1 and say, we should have given it another turn, or quite often, we should work on our uniformity. Part of the compost was that way, but another part was still too green and give me that extra, That's one. The biggest, that's the biggest. Compost too aggressive at the moment of filling. The second thing is unnecessary air movements. The balance between the amount of oxygen what we have to supply and the temperature differences what we can accept. Now, can you imagine if compost is on the green side, aggressive, then you have to accept much bigger temperature differences because inside, So the solution then is not to speed up that fan or enter more air, because then you are losing moisture and not creating the optimum conditions for those microorganisms. The solution for that problem is in phase 1. Do a better job over there. Start earlier with uniformer material and so on and so on. Keep the moisture. There are still a number of tunnels running on a 1-speed fan, which in my opinion is difficult to keep the moisture level, because the fan should be controlled in such a way that you control the temperature in a given range, accepting 4, 3, 5 degrees difference maximum, and then speed up the fan or lower the fan depending on the temperature development. But still a number of farms have rooms, phase 2 rooms or tunnels, where there is no speed control, so you just run a certain amount of air and you are losing quite a bit of moisture. Another thing is, believe it or not, we almost forgot that, is the insulation. I saw in one of your seminars that somebody was using as an example that cold glass with water. Yeah? And you saw some condensation. Now, let me hand out. Dan was so nice to make some copies for you. And look at 50 degrees Celsius. Let's say that we run our phase 2 in that range somewhere. You see what the air can hold, the saturation point is 90 gram per cubic meter. More or less 94, yeah? Okay. Do you realize that if your tunnels are not well insulated, whether that is the roof or the walls, or what people try to do, moisturizing the air, because they say, listen, during phase 2 or during spawn run, God damn, I'm losing so much moisture. Yeah? So underneath in the plenum, I am using water, yeah, mist or whatever, to humidify the air. Believe it or not, that way you are drying the air. And if you tell people that, they think you had a bad night's sleep or so. Because they think, come on, But look, if you have water available, let's say 15 degree Celsius water, and you have a system, nozzles or so, in the plenum to moisturize the air. You see what that saturation point of that 15 degrees Celsius air is? What is the saturation point? 12.8, 13 gram per cubic meter. So, here is that tunnel. Here is the plenum, and here you are spraying water to humidify the air. And that water, 15 degree or whatever, 20 degree, that doesn't matter, with a saturation point of, let's say, 15 gram or 14 grams, will meet the air, the circulation, and the air, here is the compost in the tunnel, and that air will have 50 or 45 degrees coming out of the compost. That air is almost saturated with moisture because it has gone through that compost, and you bring that air and mix it with some fresh air, and then you spray it with water, and the effect will be that there will be quite a bit of condensation because you are cooling down that air by that, and bring down your relative humidity, your saturation point, maybe from, what was it, 90 gram or so, 94? Yeah, maybe you bring it, that combination will bring it back to 50 or 40 gram per cubic meter, but it means that you are losing instead of gaining. You are losing 30, 40 gram per cubic meter. So sometimes it sounds funny that you say, hey, spraying water and I'm drying the air, but that's what you are doing. And the very same air, if that air is passing through a cold wall, whether that is the floor of the plenum, if it is not well insulated, you are losing. Why do you think that there is sometimes a layer of water underneath here? Or a wet floor, or a wet ceiling, or dripping? That's because of that. So, it is a number of factors, and the biggest is, again, the compost quality, if that compost is really, at the moment of filling, aggressive or well done, uniformity of that material, and then a number of other factors, and part is the facility, the farm, the insulation, and so on and so on. Keep that moisture. Yes?
If I come out of the tunnel a little dry, can I add water prior to spawning?
I should say, in general, the results are not that good. One thing for sure, if you start supplementing, then it is in my opinion, absolute no-no. Supplement and water most times create green molds and so on. It has perhaps to do that the protection breaks down easier, or you make the material more attractive for the trichoderma. But in general, I should go for the somewhat drier and try to make up somewhat later, not so much at the moment of spawning. The proper answer is, of course, you try to avoid that situation, but again, we touched on certain things, and so you work on that. You are realizing that this is just correcting a problem. But it is a problem, so you should work on that. Again, in the past we have had farms who said you can avoid the negative aspects if you are adding some acid to that water. And most times, just they didn't have any research to back that up, but it's just a technique what developed on certain farms, especially in Switzerland. They did that, Kuhn did it, Sinden talked about it sometimes, adding a little bit of phosphoric acid to the water, and then they seem to eliminate, for whatever reason, the negative factors. In general, I must say, what you could do better if you are a tray or a shelf bed grower and you do your phase 2 in a room, it is a poor job, but at least it can be done. I did it, and several growers, just prior to cool down. You are free of ammonia and so on. It will help. You have that crusty layer on the surface, compost in trays or shells, and then water somewhat. That helps to cool down and keep that surface layer somewhat softer. You are not really adding moisture because that's difficult. You have to add quite a bit to bring that up 1% or so. But at least it will help somewhat. So in general, try to correct the problem in an earlier stage. You can do something to correct somewhat. If you are supplementing, in my opinion, no. What you can do then is later on, during spawn run, try to avoid as much as possible drying. Again, the 2-speed or controllable fan speed, if you talk about doing spawn run in tunnels or even in normal growing rooms, try to minimize the amount of air. That has a lot to do, again, with the selectivity of the compost. If you have a problem, and most of you know that, if you have a problem, temperature problem, in spawn run, I'm not talking about phase 2, but even in spawn run in the tunnel, you better go back to your phase 1 because your compost is still too aggressive and you have to fight that by extra air, and therefore you are losing moisture. If you talk about improving the conditions, they say, looking around what's going on in the world, what is the biggest impact improving composting? Phase 1. What has the big... Okay, the supplementation, the supply of air, oxygen, and as the result of a building or whatever, having more uniform temperatures in that rig. Now, they say, common sense, that doesn't need to be a $100,000 building. What about plastic? And they came up with something like this, kind of a plastic tent. That was the first step. The second step was a combination of that tent and say, hey, if we suck the air from the top of that tent and bring it in again underneath, then we are working on the temperature uniformity through that entire rig. And at the very same time, if we add 5, 10 or X% fresh air to that air, then we take care of that oxygen level in. Now and they were, as far as they reported at that time, successful. Many years ago, we made a mistake by believing that if the beds are somewhat looser, it's easier to get rid of the CO2 and that kind of things, not realizing that you create actually a kind of insulation layer. So that's a good thing. Here, and then you see that there are always those interactions. This could well be part of that problem, talking about moisture quality, that short indoor compost, that underdone compost, you are not able to pack that as good, and so on and so on. So, but you are right, the more compact, the easier the heat exchange and so on. But here again, the better your compost is done, the better, the easier to pack it up to that point.